Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I have the wonderful Sarah Richardson. Sarah is a professor of history of science and studies of women, gender, and sexuality at Harvard University. She's a historian, philosopher of science. She directs the Harvard GenderSci Lab, which is a collaborative interdisciplinary research lab dedicated to generating concepts, methods, and theories for biomedical research on sex and gender. And she's written a few books, and her latest one is The Maternal Imprint, The Contested Science of Maternal-Fetal Effects. And that's what we talk about in this conversation. We started by talking about some of her background and why she wrote the book. We talk about human developmental plasticity and why that's important for intrauterine growth and how this impacts the evolution of postnatal growth. We talk about the importance of Weismann's philosophy of science for maternal health. We talk about maternal impressions theories. We talk about, for a little bit, the complicated history with eugenics on maternal health. And we talk about the importance of animal studies to understand maternal and fetal effects. We have a nice discussion on how there's this ongoing emphasis, even currently, on birth weight. So when infants are born or when babies are born, they will, we talk about their birth weight and why that's an important marker for many things. And she questions some of that and how should there be other kind of standards or yardsticks that we use. We talk about the unfinished story of epigenetics, how there's some interesting things about it, but that it's not as robust as we want it to be yet. And what we can say about maternal fetal effects pragmatically. I have to say, this was a big delight and a lot of fun to have this conversation with Sarah. She was super nice and just absolutely brilliant. Her book is thoroughly researched and a very, very good read, and I highly recommend it. And so now I bring you Sarah Richardson. I am here with Sarah Richardson. Sarah, thank you so much for coming on. I greatly appreciate it. And I'm really excited to talk about your new book that you have coming out. So before we get into it, just tell listeners who you are, what you do, what your research is, and all that fun stuff.
Sure, happy to be here. I'm a historian and philosopher of science. My work focuses on the sciences of sex, gender, sexuality, and reproduction. I think really deeply and critically about the structures of inference and explanation in these scientific fields, in their historical and social contexts, and in relation to contemporary controversies in these scientific areas.
Yeah, that's definitely what you cover in your book, which I'm sure we'll get into it, which I kind of read the book and I was just kind of, it sounded very interesting. And then as I started getting through it, I was like, oh, wow, I wasn't expecting to read some of this, which was a pleasant surprise because your handling of it, you navigate some of those tense waters in the book really, really well, I think. So it's very, very good. The book is called The Maternal Imprint, The Contested Science of Maternal-Fetal Effects. And it's out November 5th. Is this correct? At least in the United States. Mm-hmm. So that's wonderful. And I guess before we get into the details, why this topic in particular? Were you wanting to write about this and write about a book and kind of give some of the history and the science of some of these elements?
Well, two converging matters brought me to this book. The first was about a decade ago, there was a very notable uptick in research interest in the maternal-fetal interface. And this was driven in part by a rising area of scientific research called epigenetics, which we'll probably discuss during the course of this interview, which is an area of research that I would characterize as post-genomic. It's after the major genome sequencing projects, and it is attempting to understand the relationship between genes and their environments and the specific mechanisms involved with that. And a lot of that epigenetic research was interested in early life development in the womb and the way in which the maternal body and the fetal body interacted to create programming in the fetus's genomes. And the other thing that was of interest to me in this is that I'm a historian of genetics. And in the history of genetics, the idea that everything's not in the genes has been a kind of form of anti-genetic determinism, has often appealed to the role of the uterine environment, very early environmental exposures. And I was very interested in this history as a historian of genetics, just the way in which the maternal body complicated simple ideas about what heredity is.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. I think what I've come to realize, which I can understand if I take a charitable view, is that touching genetic research and history and talking about it and studying it is in some ways, for some people and how some people discuss it, kind of, touching the nuclear rods of sorts, right? And obviously, which we'll talk about, there's a long history of eugenics early on when we first started, doing a lot of this type of research. But I think in the book, and you very carefully try to say what is and what isn't. But I guess just before we get into that, why do you think currently there is such a hesitancy and or animus about talking about various features of genetics and or the history of genetics? Why do you think that kind of exists at the moment?
Oh, interesting. Maybe you'll follow up and you'll tell me more detail about what you're thinking about. But I still think we live in an era of great hope and hype around what genes can explain. And I would even argue this despite the development I just pointed to, which is more of an interest in the interaction between the environment and the genome. I think the genome is still king. And people, the genomics has become a platform for research across nearly every field of the life sciences. And I still think that there's deep symbolic and metaphorical weight around the genome as the ultimate template for human life. I think, of course, where the caution comes in is the concern that in a focus on genes as determinants of human outcomes, that we might be ignoring the role of the social and physical environment. And so over the last half century, as we've moved into the genetic era, people doing work on the social and physical environment have continuously complained that their work is being marginalized and that we need a more fulsome, a more balanced understanding of the determinants of human life outcomes. So that it has been a very important counterweight to genetic determinist approaches. But I think everyone agrees that it's one of the most incredible transformations in our understanding of human biology to have the sequence of the human genome, and that it is going to be a foundation for biomedical science moving forward.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I firmly agree with you on that. I see it also as a space of, as we have the whole genome sequence, but I see it as a space of a lot of hope of how we understand things. I guess my initial question was more so if it seems, and maybe this is just a part of what humans do sometimes, is that there's this idea of you have to pick a side, right? This genetic determinism, or it's all environment. And I've had a few people on that have talked about, I think honestly about, some people may emphasize, one more than the other, but I think anybody worth their salt is saying we need to look at the gene environment interactions. And now that we have the genome sequence, and now that we understand many things in our environment and understand many things within our social structures, that we can fully have a more robust understanding of all of those interactions from when someone's in utero and then afterwards, and how does that help us understand more about what it means to be human? So that's how I take it, and so I would share your hopeful bent on this as well, and so hopefully we can talk about some of that.
Well, what I would say is there is one of the projects of the book is to tell the history of biosocial science. So it isn't just since 10 years ago that people have been thinking that way. Many scholars and thinkers over the past 130 years since the gene arrived have posited that what we need to understand is not only bodies in their environments, but the complex and dynamic interaction between biological and social factors in order to understand the role of the social and the role of the environmental. And the maternal body and the embeddedness of a fetus in the environment of the maternal body has been a central space for exploring these ideas, as I show in the book. So there's this way in which there's a history of our present to be told by thinking about how scientists have grappled with the interaction between the social and the biological through the contested space of maternal-fetal interactions.
Yeah, I agree. And you're really laying out kind of the central thesis of your book, which really comes through, and telling that interaction and telling it with an understanding of the history of genetics and gene environment interactions. I guess early on in the book, you talk about the human developmental plasticity is greatest in the critical period of intrauterine growth and maternal environment, which impact the fetus. And so maybe as we get started with some of the stuff in the book, what are the major evolutionary functions of adapting to a postnatal environment, and how you see it?
Yeah, so there I'm describing a theory, and this is an important theoretical framework for research today in the field of developmental origins of health and disease and fetal programming research. And this theory argues that developmental plasticity, as you said it, is greatest in the fetal period, and also offers an evolutionary theory, an adaptive theory, that there would be adaptive mechanisms in our genes that would create a dynamic between the maternal body and the fetal body so that it could receive cues of what its environment will be like. And so develop adaptations while it is growing that will help it live in that world. And so the classic example of this is the hypothesis, sometimes known as the mismatch theory, that one of the reasons for the rise in chronic diseases over the last half century is that we went from a period of low nutrition very rapidly to a period of ubiquitous high, maybe overnutrition. So that previously fetuses that grew up, say in the 1930s, in a period of deprivation in communities that had poor nutrition, would have been tuned to a world that was deprived. And so when they come out into that world, they need to eat everything in sight and be attracted to salty and fatty foods. And that's not a good phenotype to have in our world, actually.
Right.
So this is a mismatch theory of what they were cued for. Now, this is a theory. This is a structuring hypothesis, and it's part of a whole contested arena of argumentation around how to interpret this evidence. But this is a framework for why there's been increasing interest in the fetal period, because some of the rise of these chronic diseases is hard to explain otherwise.
Yeah, no, I think that's important to know. It really does seem to be understanding what's the gene's eye view of evolution in terms of the mother and both the fetus, of trying to understand, well, how do we understand the gene's eye view, but then also how do we understand it within a context, right? People don't live in a vacuum, right? We live in an environment. We live where, certain areas where we're going to have certain, dispositions. Early on in the book, there's a man, right? Is it a man? It's called Weismann. I forget his first name. Who's
August Weismann.
yeah,
Yes.
is a central figure in the first part of the book, and so I guess why you talk about him a lot. I didn't know about him, so it's very interesting. Why is his philosophy of science so important? And what was it? The fact that he believed that hereditary aspects were equal in both paternal and maternal, so basically that mom and dad were both contributing, not just the mother. Or what other aspects of his philosophy of science made him so consequential?
Yes. So August Weismann is the founder of modern hereditarian theory. And so he's writing in the 1880s and 1890s in a space where there are many competing theories for how we inherit things from our parents. And there's growing evidence from biology and cell biology of how what kinds of particles and parts are involved in the gametes. So we are starting to see the chromosomes, for example, and see the nucleus of a cell. And many people, in fact, most at that time, believed that when you inherit from your parents, you don't just inherit their traits that are internal to them, but you inherit markers of their whole lifetime of experience. Mm-hmm. So this is sometimes called the Lamarckian view. Mm-hmm. Well, Weismann ended that. And when he ended that, he also ended theories about the asymmetric or different role of mothers and fathers, men and women, in heredity. Mm-hmm. So he posited the germplasm theory of heredity. Mm-hmm. And this is the idea that is totally intuitive to us and that we learn sort of in our first class in biology, right? That there are particles that are in the nucleus of the cell, that they are absolutely separate from your bodily cells, which bear the imprint of all of your experiences, and that those components are equal in quantitatively and qualitatively equal. They're the same in the egg as they are in the sperm. They meet and they create a new being. And this quantitatively and qualitatively equal contribution of the mother and father that transits, this is called the continuity of the germplasm, transits from generation to generation, is a radical departure from a very different way of thinking. One that held that the in the Aristotelian, like deep sense, that the father provides the spark and the vital elements of the soul, and the mother just provides the material and the nutrition for the being, right? That's a very asymmetric, and in fact is part of the symbolic foundation of ideas about male superiority and female inferiority. And Weismann would have none of that. He's like, no, the male and female contribute the same. And it's important for me to motivate this at the beginning of the book for the reader to fully understand how challenging the idea that there are maternal fetal effects that can in some sense be thought of as a part of heredity is to the foundational ideas of genetics, right? It's really a challenge to that egalitarian idea of how we inherit. And also so the reader can understand that whole pre-existing debate where it was long presumed that mothers imprint on their offspring and that this is a key component of development and heredity. But yes, the other part of it is that I go through the way Weismann presented his argument, the way he took down the Lamarckians. And I talk about his philosophy of science in the sense that he argued that until you have a mechanistic theory, he had the particles, he had the whole way it would fit together, that a mechanistic theory that made sense in the light of evolutionary theory. He was the original Darwinian hardcore. Until you have that, a mechanism and a good theory, that certain questions and claims need to be thought of as not really scientific claims. So he said, these people who are saying that, a mother saw experienced a fire while pregnant, and that's why her offspring has the mark of a flame on his forehead. These questions, he said, do not even have the right to be thought of as scientific questions, let alone scientific facts, because they're not situated mechanistically, they're not situated in a larger structure of unifying explanation. So his complaint was not just that these were empirically not proven, but furthermore, that they weren't scientific questions because they didn't even meet our intuitions of what could be possibly true in the world. And so I set that up because the series of controversies and contestations I go through essentially replicate this debate. With maternal fetal effects, the issue is their crypticity, as I argue in the book.
Yeah.
They are simply hard to prove. And so what do you do with that? Are these, and over the many decades, this kind of difference in scientific view, some people think, well, if we haven't proven them true yet, we can keep trying, and we'll try it around this corner with this new tool. And we feel that it's just that we haven't gotten the evidence yet. They must be true. And others say, look, this science is not magic. We can't really prove this. Yeah. So it sets up this really set of different worldviews about how we can know what we can explain using scientific methods.
Yeah, no, which you do super well. I mean, it's one of those things where, in my reading of it, is that Weismann was kind of ostracized, right? He definitely had strong critics of what he was saying, because he's going against this, this whole enterprise that was thinking very differently, and so he basically is saying, like, wait a minute, all, both are involved. And so how does this, I guess, spawn, not necessarily directly, but spawn into kind of the next phase you talk about in terms of maternal impression theories, which seemed, if I remember correctly, you say that there are some, pros and cons to it. I mean, this is kind of a colloquial way of saying that, but there are things about it that were maybe valuable, but then there are many really terrible ways about, in terms of, the responsibility on the mother tremendously. So what can you say about the maternal impression theories that were, either concurrent at his time or shortly after?
Absolutely. So first, let me say, Weismann was very much discussed, debated, criticized at the time, but of course later would be venerated in the textbooks and became the founder of the germplasm theory, and very much almost total consensus by, say, the 1915s, 1920s. But to go to maternal impressions theories, which I mentioned earlier with my example of seeing a fire and the mark of a flame, that's a very visual, very direct impression. Those theories have a very, very long history. They were taken very seriously by leading scientists, embryologists, natural philosophers, from Descartes all the way up to the great German embryologists in the 19th century. But they also had a folk life, a life of beliefs among regular people who had ideas about how heredity works, right? And so even though Weismann's ideas were coming alive within the sciences, I show that they also triggered a sort of backlash in which we had a sudden rebirth and uptick of these theories of maternal impressions. And I look at a particular construct that came into being around this time, prenatal culture theory. And these theories really asserted that the mother's role is greatest in heredity, and that you can overcome the limitations of any hereditary endowment by carefully conditioning your fetus during its gestation. Mothers were instructed not only to take good nutrition and things like that, but to do math equations, to study, to read poetry, to rest their minds and their eyes on beautiful things, to consider the moral and physical development of their child as directly determined by their own actions and behaviors and experiences. And I do show in that chapter the tensions around this, as you mentioned. So there were a great number of feminist maternal impressions theories, for example, prenatal culturalists who said, look, you need to give women rights, because if they're not free in their soul and being, then their children will develop into slaves. They need to imbibe and embody freedom so that they shape their fetuses to be full, free citizens, right? And yet at the same time, these kinds of ideologies could be used to conscript the role of mothers, to argue, as folks did at the time, that people who were pregnant or potentially pregnant should not hold certain kinds of jobs, right? And to argue that women should be coddled and protected from certain things that could include education or certain kinds of environments that might expose them to nefarious characters. So that kind of approach could lead to ideas about the responsibility and ultimately the blame of women for the problems of society, right? For failing to properly cultivate the character of their fetuses.
I mean, look, here, when I was reading it and hearing it now again, I mean, it sounds bonkers almost. I mean, it's so like, it's extremely literal, right? It's just like, it's so literal. Like whatever you're doing is going to directly, and it does. I mean, you say in the book, and it really, like, I don't know, it kind of bothered me. It was like, why was there so much, like, I mean, not just responsibility, but almost like this, like crazy amount of pressure on a woman, like, you know, if she did one wrong thing, or, you know, didn't, read the right book, or didn't look at the right thing, that was going to damn her offspring, you know. It's hard to look at that, 100 years later or something and say, or 120 years later and be like, yeah, that's wild. Like, how are we actually, like, these are medical doctors that were legitimately saying this. And obviously you don't want to look at things, in 1920 with 2020 eyes, but, 2021 eyes. But how do we, I don't know, how no one was saying, like, wait a minute, this is maybe not true. Or how can we take a charitable view of that theory at the time?
Well, first of all, people were saying it wasn't true. There was a vibrant debate about this at the time, and there were the Weismannians. But there were many people, and certainly I call this a vernacular or folk or popular or socio-medical theory that definitely believed that this is a very important component of heredity. Now, remember, it didn't just hold the belief that the mother could hurt the fetus, but also could develop and positively imprint on the fetus. And so that's another aspect, the hopeful, the progressive element there. When I look at it, I actually see a lot of similarity to, believe it or not, a lot of similarity to our discourses today about how pregnant women should behave.
They can't smoke, they can't drink, they can't do all this stuff, right? They can't lift certain things.
You should sleep on your left side, don't get in a hot tub, don't take a single Tylenol. These are absolutely, there's intense scrutiny and surveillance of pregnant women's behavior. And if you look at the scientific literature, you will see tens of thousands of papers funded by public funders that are working on the correlations between all kinds of pregnancy exposures and all kinds of offspring outcomes. I talk in the book, and we may talk about this later, about one such study which looked at the effects of experiencing an ice storm on all sorts of outcomes. Ice storm during gestation, on all sorts of outcomes for the child. So I put that chapter there in part to and I don't say later, this is just like prenatal culture theories,
Right.
but to allow the reader to draw their own conclusions and think about that past in relation to this present. So if we think those things are strange and obviously wrong, we ought to look a little closer at the way we talk today about pregnant women's responsibilities and duties while pregnant.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you there. Now, there's seemingly some, you could say that maybe at the time that, there was, again, the charitable view would be that people were very concerned about not harming or certainly helping their offspring with the information they had. So I think you could do that. But it does seem like it did seem to have some, sexist types of ways of how we treat women or pregnant women as well. I mean, what are some of the social cons that were at the time that maybe have ripple effects now of how we treat, or how the maybe medical profession or medicine in general may treat pregnant women? So at the time, and then the ripple effects.
Gosh, I do think there are, just to start with the positive, I do think that it's true. These were basically progressive thinkers. I mentioned that many among them wanted to empower women and direct resources to pregnant mothers by using these kinds of claims. They were absolutely entrenched in marinating in the discourses of eugenics, which was a public health discourse of uplift through reproduction and through public health guidance, grounded in the dictates of science. I think the other thing that is could be regarded as positive about it is the sort of anti-genetic determinism of it. They, in a crude way, were criticizing and reacting to the idea that it's all in the genes. They were saying, no, there is more that we can do, and there are more ways in which we can lift people up. So that's the positive. I mentioned eugenics. I think they were also very much embedded in an idea of the determinism of the body. So health is all, and good health is moral health. Good people are healthy according to the ideas of the state and the ideas of the scientists. And it was a very technocratic, in a way, vision of health. And there were many sorts of moralistic discourses running through it. And of course, it put the idea of motherhood on a pedestal that was posed as being beneficent, but in so many ways was a constrained and narrow view of what women could be. And I wouldn't attribute our contemporary discourses just to this period, but it did give the idea that mothers were incredibly powerful, but also incredibly dangerous. They could really screw things up for the rest of us. So there are many legacies, many complex legacies of this period. And I emphasize throughout the book that it is not a simple matter of patriarchal science wanting to constrain women when we think about the science of maternal-fetal effects. There are many competing and competing discourses and strange bedfellows, I would say, in the history of this area of science.
Yeah, and that's again, credit to you as someone writing the book, is that you're taking what's there and trying to show the complexity. There's different viewpoints. There's different things going on at each point in history, and you very nicely show that. So it's not just like this one way or two ways. That there's very many different ways in which people were discussing many of these topics, then and then as we go through history, which kind of leads us to eugenics, which we can park here for a minute. This is obviously a big topic that is interesting. Again, the way you talked about in the book was really nice. I think you were trying to really understand in the context of the time period what was going on with eugenics. So maybe just tell us just your overview of eugenics was, I guess, between 1880 to 1930, 40, whatever, in its heyday. And why was this such a popular idea that people were espousing, or it was very, many people were discussing this? Obviously we know about the racism and the sexism bits of it, but was some of this just ignorance of the science at the time, or was it maybe a combination of both? Just kind of tell us what it is and why it was so appealing for some people.
Yeah. So eugenics, yeah, like you said, it's a 50-year period. It's a global movement. It is a scientific movement. It's a popular movement. It's incredibly heterogeneous, which is something I emphasize. And it was in the air. If you were a scientist, a doctor, a public health expert, an educator, a pastor, these were just ideas that were thought of as progressive, as important to understanding ourselves as humans, as important to our social prescriptions for how we can transform and better society. And eugenic ideas could be put to many different ends. The key idea was that to think about our future as a society, we need to think about what is being inherited generation to generation, because what is being inherited determines the potential of the future generation. So they did have strong and often naive ideas about what traits, in fact, could be inherited. So you would see in the family histories things like pauperism could be inherited, as the tendency to poverty, or boat building skills could be inherited, right? Wrestling skills. But they also discovered, color blindness can be inherited. So it was a period of rapid expansion of genetic science, and of hereditarian ideas. And all of the prescriptions focused on reproduction, controlling and directing human reproduction to craft the next generation. And you could control it by limiting certain people's reproductive ability through sterilization campaigns or anti-miscegenation laws that prevented people of different races and ethnicities from marrying. Or in the worst end of the spectrum, the extermination of peoples. Or you could do it a different way by encouraging the people you think are fit to reproduce, right? And these led to what are called pronatalist policies that encouraged women and men who were thought of as ideal to reproduce more. And then in the mix, too, are all sorts of other ideas about reproductive uplift. And that included ideas about prenatal influences. And those prenatal influences could be during gestation. But during this period, there was such a focus on the gene, on genetic inheritance, that the discourse about prenatal influences shifted. And I really highlight this once again to trouble our common sense about, well, what's intuitive about prenatal influences? During this period, the focus on prenatal influences was on preconception. It was on the health of the sperm and the egg, because after all, most things were thought to come just from what you inherit through the sperm and the egg. And so we get a very, very different, just to use a very academic jargon term, a very different reproductive biopolitics during this period. I think you can get a sense of what I might be talking about there, like a set of ideas that are about what kinds of populations and what kind of world we want, that rely on a view of the natural world and biology. And so reproductive responsibility for future generations actually lay with both men and women, since they both equally contribute to the next generation.
Mhm.
And furthermore, during this period, there was much greater concern about paternal or men's contribution to the next generation. So men were thought of as having much more risky lifestyles. Men went to war. Men had gonads that are outside of their bodies. Men are exposed to all sorts of toxins. Men drink more. Men get sexually transmitted infections more. And so I show that much of the prenatal prescription during this period was directed toward preconception health for the gametes, the egg and the sperm, and especially toward men. And so you get almost many of the same guidances and prescriptions against imbibing certain things or certain kinds of lifestyles that we overwhelmingly see directed toward women and mothers today, directed toward men and fathers during this period.
Does this kind of give the fact that there was a shift, right? Because we talked about maternal impressions theories, where it was all about the woman, or predominantly, which is, I should say, that now during this period with eugenics, and there's overlap, but that there was more of a, well, look, men got to take care of themselves too, right? We recognize that there's a contribution for sure, and women have to take care of themselves, and still that kind of seemingly very literal way of doing things, but it's still both men and women have to take care of themselves. Is that, again, when we're looking at it in context historically, is that just one of the finer sides of that period? It's very hard to talk about the finer sides of eugenics, but I'm not trying to say that eugenics are positive necessarily, but just like one positive aspect of that time period or that context was like, hey, look, guys also need to be mindful of their health. They need to be mindful of their body and be mindful of their contribution, which, I think is reasonable to say that, when you go all the way down to current day, right? If a man and a woman, they're, having a child, or they're planning, doing the woman becomes pregnant, they're planning, they will want to look at get a history of, the man's family history, or medical history, what their issues are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We want to have both people involved. So as very complicated and controversial as this period of eugenics is, can we just say that was maybe one bright spot that came out of it? Or how do we kind of see this idea that, men's health is also important?
I would say I'm more interested as a historian here in just situating the strangeness of that in its moment. And I do think I happen to think that there should be a more balanced perspective today, but I certainly don't want there to be an extension of the same very harsh, blaming discourse and surveillance and restrictive orientation to that discourse towards men. That's not the solution. I do think that it is simply intriguing as a historian of biology to show that where we think scientifically the roots of procreation and reproduction lie in the body can determine totally different ideologies about who is responsible for what. That's really interesting.
That is very
interesting.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I think what we see in the material that I talk about during this period and the focus on men is just, you can find the same blaming and harsh discourses flipped over to men, depending on where you think biologically risk and vulnerability lies. And at that time, sperm were thought of as the most reproductively vulnerable part along the pathway of procreation. So I think I would answer it that way.
Hmm.
It would be absurd to say everything that happened or was uttered during the eugenic period is tainted by eugenics and can never be thought of as something to reclaim,
Right.
because this simply was genetics and was science and was public health prescription during this period. And it is an ineliminable part of the history of our contemporary practices in these areas.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And again, there's so many downsides of this period. I mean, and, this idea of trying to fashion these kind of, very, kind of, perfect humans, and the ones that aren't that way we should dispose of. I mean, it's just absolutely grotesque, these ways of doing it. And I sometimes wonder, is this just people didn't know, or is it just they were just terribly, in some cases racist, or and it's hard to say that because there's a lot of complex things going on at that time with limited information. But you stated earlier that the prenatal culture emphasized, this intimate alignment with physical and moral health, right, as kind of right living, and that, if you were doing this well, you were a good person or whatever, and for this kind of organic self-improvement. And that sounds great, but isn't there downsides? I mean, you talked a little bit about it, but wouldn't that be, again, if it's just the woman and or the man, like, there's a lot of pressure on that, right? Like, if I can't do this because then I have to do this, and then people are going to make these, moral attributions because I went and had too many drinks at the saloon or whatever. So and they know I'm trying to get pregnant, or my wife's pregnant or whatever. Was it almost too aspirational, too like Pollyannish of like, oh yeah, this is just, if you do this, you're going to be, perfect and all these things, and certainly weren't there examples where that didn't happen? Like, let's say everyone did everything they were supposed to by the book, and then something happens, unfortunately, it's a congenital, thing or whatever. I mean, that stuff for sure happened,
yes.
right?
So yeah, absolutely. So first of all, to say this is the period in which scientists, we knew we had very little advice to actually offer pregnant people. There very little understanding of the origin of common birth anomalies, and these were tragedies for people that could not be easily explained, and disabilities of all sorts were hard to understand and explain. And so in that space, so many theories and so many explanations flourish. What I would say about eugenics, you said, well, was it just bad science? Well, it was the best science they had at that time. And it's what they truly believed was the new and progressive and better way of understanding the world. And some of it was not wrong, like Weismann's ideas were not wrong. Right. The continuity of the germplasm remains strong today. The findings about chromosomes and linkage and all of that, there were things that later were shown to be wrong. There were things that were later shown to be unsophisticated and crude. What was wrong for sure was the great leap of confidence that they took in moving from these nascent findings to social policies that should guide our life and should guide our communities. And so it bears, though, reminding that today we also live with imperfect science, and we also live with uncertainty, and we absolutely make inferences about what we should do in light of this science. One of the long-standing errors of this way of thinking in the eugenic period was the focus on individual behaviors. So changing individual behaviors was supposed to be the way to create important social change. We changed how you reproduce and who you reproduce with and what sort of decisions you make while pregnant and before being pregnant and so on. Right. It was just, it's a way of thinking that, as you said, it gives so much scrutiny to and so much responsibility to the individual for the future of the community, right? And we still tend to do that in our public health advice today. So findings go right to how a person should conduct themselves, what foods they should eat, and so on. When I think in the larger view, there are adjustments that we can make to our larger systems and structures that historically have actually led to the greatest public health advances. And we can talk more about that as we move through the different topics in the book, but it's certainly the case that simply having more births attended and having more care prenatally and postnatally, having higher education as a parent, all of these things are much stronger associated. And those all depend on social structures and factors and investments in that way, and not on who mates with whom and how well they protect their sperm and egg.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting to look back on it and how literal it is. But you're right. There is some. I mean, look, if one time I was talking to a relative that was pregnant and it was like, if you were to go to a restaurant and get a meal and ask let's say you're 7-8 months pregnant or something, and you say like, I'm like a glass of wine. I mean, everybody in the restaurant is gonna turn their heads and just publicly shame you potentially. I mean, it just the norms we still have on some of this stuff. And like, look, I'm not sitting here advising anybody to do that, right? I'm just giving an example that there are some things that we understand that there's now, as best we can, which are still things we don't know, but that we know that there are many things that are implicated. It's not this kind of one-to-one type of thing. As you move through the book and through time and history, obviously, Mendel's genetics and his law comes into play, and so you give this interesting stories about how we were beginning to move away from that stuff and doing research on other types of mammals. And getting a more accurate picture of maternal uterine effects. So experiments we've done on horses and rabbits and mice. So in that time
all
period,
fun stuff, right?
Yeah, right. Well, what were the largest contributions of that process of doing that to understand then how we understand it for humans?
Yeah. So how did we get from the eugenic period to the present? And yes, so there we get to do some good history of biology, and it follows the pattern we know so well from the history of genetics, that before we understood these things in humans, we understand them in non-human organisms, including plants and agricultural species. So it's a slow process, partly because of what I explained earlier about Weismann and the strong paradigm for understanding heredity that Weismann and later Mendel's ideas put together. So maternal effects are outside of that. They do not fit the expected pattern. And so whenever that's the case, it is more challenging for a community of researchers to grok to the possibility that these are real and that there might be something to work with here. But in these applied fields like agricultural genetics, you can't ignore something that is in fact affecting the next generation. And so it's rare, but they did start to find some effects that seem to suggest a role for an early maternal imprint, quite apart from what genes have been inherited from the mother. And one of the most lively examples I give is the horses. Yep. So imagine in your mind the Shetland pony, tiny horse, and the Shire horse, which is a huge workhorse. And here we are in pre-World War II England at one of their agricultural stations, and scientists do that experiment. Think of it as the Doberman and Chihuahua experiment. Right. They do a reciprocal cross, meaning that female Shetland with male Shire, and then male Shetland with female Shire, and see what do the offspring look like, what do the foals look like. And in this case of the extreme cross, it looked like the foals very nearly match what the mother's size. So that means that the size of the uterus itself had constrained the growth of the offspring. So the female Shetland gave birth to a pretty normal sized Shetland looking pony, and the female Shire gave birth to a pretty normal sized Shire looking pony in these crosses. And so that was a very strong, very visual example of simply growth and size being constrained by a maternal effect, the size of the mother. So that is an early example of a maternal effect. And then I take us through the landscape of various other examples of and different experiments to drill down and better understand this. And so we get a handful of examples that I think the fun part about this part of the story is to see how scientists grapple with this challenging and confusing and very complex way of thinking about heredity and development in relation to their pre-existing ideas about heredity.
Yeah, it's interesting because you start to see a more wide range. It's like, okay, well, if we're all multicellular organisms, and then we're all, part of the, mammalian family tree, it's very large, obviously, but, how does this look in other organisms? And then how do we make some inferences, with humans? So it's very, very important. And I see this as this kind of process as a kind of bridge to, like you mentioned, some of the modern day types of maternal effects that we see now. And I think shortly after this, in one of the chapters after this section, you start to talk about birth weight. So kind of moving to humans now. And, this is an interesting part of the book because, when I was in grad school and I was doing plenty of neuropsych rotations and stuff, you get a full long history, of all this stuff. And one of the things you ask, is if you're doing any type of evaluation, is you ask about developmental periods. We want to know about developmental periods. Like, that's super important. Did you meet developmental milestones, et cetera? And one of the things we'd always ask is low birth weight. Was there any, and if low birth weight was implicated, it could be contributing to intellectual disabilities. It could be implicated in learning disabilities. Again, not a one-to-one. It's not a causation, but it's a one correlational thing as something that could be implicated. And, I never really thought too much about it, but then I was reading your book and I was just like, oh yeah, like that was always a question to ask, is the low birth weight types of thing. And so kind of give us the overview or summary of why, why medicine still heavily relies on birth weight as an indicator for many things, especially negative outcomes such as, your liver and kidneys, and then cognitive deficits, as I was mentioning.
It's fascinating to hear. I'm going to return to some of what you said there.
Sure.
So big picture, yes, I actually, when I started writing this chapter, I'm like, why isn't this whole book about birth weight? Because how interesting it is that we accord so much importance and we read so much into birth weight. I mean, for heaven's sake, we put it on a birth announcement. Why?
Yeah. Right. This person's 6 pounds or 10 pounds, whatever.
Now, so I want to draw a distinction early on between low birth weight and just birth weight. So low birth weight is a well-defined epidemiological and clinical category. So this is usually 5.5 pounds or smaller. So these are very light babies. And there are strong correlations between being born very light and a whole range of outcomes, correlations. And the causality question is absolutely the key here, right? So we have two different models. There's the model where it is because you were born small that you have this later poor outcome. And then the other model is that the fact that you were born small is a signal or sign of some other deprivation. And it's not the being small itself that causes the later disability, but it's a sign, it's a marker, biomarker, perhaps. It matters which one of these we're talking about, right?
Sure,
For interpreting birth weight. Now, much of what I talk about in this chapter is not about low birth weight babies, but just about birth weight. So whether you were born 8 or 7 pounds, say, right? Like it's just variation in birth weight, period, and what it might correlate with. So this is a very complex story, and it is the space through which scientists from extremely diverse fields, from neuroscience to the nutritional sciences and developmental biology and so many other fields, try to understand whether these things that have popped up occasionally in the agricultural and animal research could explain patterns in human populations. So birth weight is one of these ubiquitously recorded demographic variables. You can find tables comparing Swedish average birth weight to the average birth weight of Americans. During the early 20th century, these become signifiers of health at a very meta level. And it becomes a metric that is also enrolled in discussions about differences between Black Americans and white Americans. And that's the story that I focus on in this chapter. Very complex story of how to reason about the causes, and this is a long-standing gap in birth weight between Black and white American babies. The gap is about the same as it was 100 years ago today. Both Black Americans and white Americans babies have on average grown in average birth weight, but the gap is still about the same today. And we have 50 years, more than 50 years, but about a half century of debates about the causes of this. And of course, it's of great concern because it is a health disparity. And we live in a society with huge racial stratification. And could it be that, this is what people ask, could it be that this initial life deficit is a part of that? And there come in these theories about maternal effects and early life development and the social environment as transmitted through the mother. And it's just an incredibly entangled, and of course, this is what drew me to it, set of issues.
Yeah. So I want to come to that. So, but the first thing is, so a few things here. So typically, let me make this a little more colloquial for listeners. So if I know someone and they're pregnant and they have a child, even for me, right? One of the first questions I will ask is, baby's healthy, mama's healthy? Yep. Okay. How many pounds? How many inches? Right? That's just, or centimeters, whatever it is, and if they say, oh, about 7.5, 8 pounds, like, oh, healthy baby. That's the first thing I'll say, right? I'm guilty of this as well. Somebody says, about 10 and a half, be like, wow, that's a large child. Wow. It's very like, they'll lose all the weight, whatever, or a couple pounds. Someone says, oh, they're about 5.5, 6. I'll be like, oh, is everything okay? There's a certain type of heuristic I think most people use, that most people have a certain range. Obviously, if you're born, before the due date and you're, technically a preemie, there's going to be certain changes there too. But what can we understand or say, I don't want to say conclusively, but what can we understand just in general about birth weight? It is a biomarker, but is it meaning that it is saying something, but we don't know that it's prescriptive for saying other things? Or how can we understand first that kind of difference between what it is saying and what it is not saying, I guess?
Oh man, so this is very hard. I'm gonna go for birth weight tells you very little. Now, I made the distinction before between low birth weight, very low birth weight, and sort of ranges above that.
Yeah.
But okay, so just to give a teaser, a little flavor of this, the first distinction you need to make is between preterm birth, low birth weight babies, or babies of lower birth weight, and those at term. So preterm, we would expect them developmentally to be smaller. If you're born at 28 weeks, you're smaller. That's the size of a 28-month-old baby. Right. So that is a different kind of condition than an infant that is born at 9 months and is small for gestational age. And those point to totally different stories and, in fact, totally different epidemiologies, as I show in the book. And the other thing that is important to understand is that context is very important. So whereas it seems like low birth weight, one of the things that is definitely correlated with low birth weight is smoking during pregnancy. That is a very firm finding, one of the few. So smoking during pregnancy is associated with low birth weight. Similarly, low birth weight is associated with being a twin. Similarly, low birth weight is associated with being born at a high altitude. Now, the same birth weight caused by these three different mechanisms is not associated with the same poor outcomes, right? So yeah.
Sorry, I want to jump in here. Is this just on the mother or also the father in terms of smoking and is it the both, or is it just with the mother?
Yeah, good question. I hear I'm only talking about these comparisons with or correlations with the mother.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think I might have said low altitude a moment ago. I meant high altitude. So these are just examples of the many things that have been associated with being born small, and that actually don't usually carry poor sequelae just for being born small. So the reason that you got small matters. And if it's, severe malnutrition versus just being born at high altitude or just being a twin and it being a constraint of growth. So it is very hard to definitively say what being born small really means. And that's sort of part of the fun of this chapter is helping to pull apart and a classic case of a biomarker in which much significance is invested. Yet over many decades of trying to understand this one variable, all we've gotten is that it's very complex and it's very contextual. And so I move into, in the later part of the book, how researchers in maternal-fetal effects science have really moved away from birth weight and been seeking other ways of measuring prenatal environment and understanding its longer implications, because it just no longer is credible as a marker of what prenatal life was like or a predictor of what effects you might experience later.
No, that's very helpful. I think that's important to underscore there. Briefly, before we move to epigenetics, you mentioned the differences between black infants and white infants, and again, right, complicated, very complicated. So the birth weight thing is complicated, and then when you bring in certain types of variables, with race or maybe environment, etc., there's more complications. So what can we say, I guess, about that difference? And what can we say, if anything at all, about the effects of intergenerational, intrauterine environments for Black Americans?
So notice that I've the whole time I've said Black Americans and white Americans. This racial disparity in birth weight does not occur in other contexts or between white Americans and people of African descent born in other locales, right? So we're talking about a very contextually specific difference. There's been several eras and stages of research. One of the fun things I was able to do is uncover the role of some under-recognized African-American researchers in the mid-20th century in doing the first studies that showed that the birth weight gap between African-Americans correlates really strongly with things like a gap in access to prenatal care and gap in income. And so you can see this clearly by looking at variation within each group. So if you look among African-American infants, those born with lots of access to prenatal care and in high incomes have birth weights very similar to the average for all American infants. So that work showed very persuasively that a strong determinant of this difference is just simply access to care and health status and income status, all of which are entwined and confounded with one another. And then you have some interesting patterns that can't be explained by that. So these patterns have to do with infants born usually at term who are small for gestational age, and class doesn't explain it. There's still a little bit left that isn't explained, and that's what we're discussing. So what is it? What is it that still sustains? And this is extremely hard to study and to know for sure. It's complex, and it's very, like, I talk about theories that say, look, Black women, for example, who are higher classes, still have small infants, but the whole context for their infants' birth size is different, because when you work in a higher echelon as a Black woman, you experience more racism, because you're in a whiter world. And furthermore, you're removed from kin networks that lower class SES women, Black women, are more embedded in when they are pregnant. So it's just so ecologically specific, so specific to the histories of Black people in this country and the ways in which families have been structured. And there are these strange and unexpected effects of upward mobility for people that have an impact on their health and therefore their birth outcomes. And so it isn't a simple story, but it does tell a story of our bodies as embedded in our social environments. And it does tell a story of how health outcomes could be related to experiences of racism.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that there is an interesting thread here between the social environment and even more so the specific contexts that are implicated here, and specifically for Black Americans. But it's interesting how these things in the environment and how in certain contexts that people live in, that it impacts just the size of a fetus. It's just an interesting variable. It doesn't, I don't know. It's interesting to say that we don't know enough about this, or we're still trying to figure this out, or it's really, we know it's complicated, but we just don't know how it's complicated. And then, yes, when you start breaking down many of the environments and obviously the history, and then, yes, obviously racism for Black Americans, it's a more sobering fact as well. And I would, I don't know if you mentioned this in the book, but, could contribute, I would imagine, to how many Black women are at a elevated or high risk of in terms of their pregnancy, especially third trimester, and then obviously in labor is very high risk, more so than with other groups. And that's something that's a pretty much an established fact, which is, again, why and all the variables and the factors is something that's an ever evolving kind of puzzle and mystery. So it's very interesting data to explore. I want to talk about before we get to the end here about epigenetics. So you talk about that a lot in the book. It's I've talked about it on the podcast before. I talked about it mostly with, I believe, not a lot. We talked about it for, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes. So with Kevin Mitchell, who wrote an interesting book called Innate. It's about genetics and talks about basically the developmental model of it. That the program is set in place when you're in utero, and then things change and happen in developmental context, kind of that developmental plasticity that we have, that is genes interacting with the environment. So it's not just genes set you on your path in life, and it's not just the environment chooses it. It's kind of this middle ground. And so we talked a little bit about epigenetics. And so I guess just briefly tell us what that is and why, again, there's this kind of specter of like why people are so very interested in it. They're very excited about it. They like to put a lot of weight into it, and maybe too excited, maybe putting the cart before the horse kind of thing. So just kind of tell us what it is and kind of how this epigenetics relates to maternal fetal environment and impact.
Yeah, so over the last 15 years or so, people who study maternal fetal effects have a new tool at their disposal. They can study mothers and their infants in pregnancy and afterward and track them. And they can use epigenetics. They can take a blood sample and they can assess which genes are turned off or turned on by looking at epigenetic signals called methylation on the genome. And so this provides a nice quantitative tool for looking at whether there might be changes in gene regulation associated with different kinds of exposures during the prenatal period. And there's great hope that this, compared to birth weight, that crude metric, that this will point the way toward an understanding of how these early life exposures mechanistically could influence later life things. And now we're talking about everything: kitchen sink, ADHD, heart disease, obesity, educational attainment, name it. And so could there be mechanisms? And so this provides something measurable. It provides something that interfaces with the genome, and it gets away again from the crudeness of birth weight. So I look at the introduction of epigenetic methods into this field. So predefined problems, predefined study populations, and now we add epigenetics to the mix. And the primary tool that they're using in these studies, although I look at other ways of using epigenetics, the primary tool is epigenome-wide association studies using a very particular platform, the Illumina gene chip. So this is a commercial gene chip that allows the rapid assessment of epigenomic profiles. I'm sorry,
I don't want to interrupt. Is this different than the GWAS studies? So the genome-wide association studies, or are they kind of connected, or is there a slight difference? Or
it's really the same methodology, right? Okay. So you are assessing hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of sites all at once, and then slapping that against a set of traits and seeing if you get any association. So many of the same critiques and conversations about inferences around GWAS would apply equally to EWAS, right? And so this is a challenging set of, it's hard to know how to interpret these findings. You definitely find lots of things when you apply this technology. The relationship between finding differences in epigenetic signals and finding a mechanism that can be characterized as causal is the one that I focus on here. Right. And it is still very tenuous to say that we have uncovered patterns of epigenomic programming. That's a very strong claim from fetal exposures in the maternal intrauterine environment that could explain later life outcomes. In any case, the kinds of factors that are in play here are minor exposures. I don't mean minor to diminish them. I just mean that it's small. We're not talking about people who have lived through in the womb a major lesion or exposure to a major toxin, but perhaps they were gestated in a body that was more stressed than other bodies, or perhaps they were gestated in a body that was more had more adiposity than other bodies. And the effects that we're looking at are also small effects. So I like to give the example of the Dutch famine studies that one of the strongest findings is about 2 centimeters more of adiposity around the waist in women at age 59. So these are the effects, those are the exposures, and epigenetics is supposed to mediate. And so I walk through 3 widely cited foundational studies in the field of maternal-fetal epigenetic programming, and try to unpack how the scientists talk about causality, how they use epigenetics to try to add more certainty to causal claims and to address critiques of lack of evidence or unsupported inference in previous research using epigenetics. I'm a skeptic. As I'm sure you found, I really think the claims that come out the other end, often as headlines, are much, much stronger than can be supported by the evidence at this time. This is still a very developing field.
Yeah.
It's not that we might not find some important mediators, but we're definitely not there. So the claims about fetal programming are far stronger than what the evidence can support right now. I'm happy to talk about any of these examples more.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. I think that with the EWAS and with what I've looked at myself, the GWAS, is that I think it's fine. It's a fine tool, but it's still very much in its infancy. And that, we might be able to extract some things, but many of the things that you highlight, which I also would agree, is that there's, modest effect sizes, there's a lot of cofactors, there's low replicability. There's many things that we have to sort of figure out. And, again, it sounds like a shiny new tool that has a lot of promise and everyone gets all excited and, but there's still challenges and issues with it. And so I don't think we shouldn't do it. I think we just have to be more, I don't know, maybe more cautious about how we definitively say what certain things are. But, maybe in 10, 15, 20 years, it will be much reformed and much better as it evolves. So as I
talk about an example, everyone knows Dr. Oz, Oprah's doctor. In his pregnancy handbook, he makes claims like epigenetics is like a volume that you can turn up or turn down as a mother. Depending on what you eat, you can control what your child's epigenome will be. So this is the kind of discourse that pops out the other end in direct advice to pregnant women using the specter of you are programming your child's genes, right? And so this part of the book is me, the philosopher and science critic and science analyst, looking at this research, having done the history, and saying, all right, let's situate this in the long-standing ways in which we've thought about the maternal-fetal relation and risk in this space. And we're coming to this with a set of assumptions about what is plausible, what is likely, what is common sense, and where responsibility lies and where intervention should occur, that is deeply grounded in these historical frameworks for thinking about motherhood. And we have to be very careful as we apply these new technologies to think critically about our assumptions about causality. And I say these assumptions make certain things seem intelligible and common sense and make us look at them less critically because of that. So we have to pull back. And so I use the history in the book to sort of motivate thinking about this current moment.
Yeah, no, and that's I think we need that. We need folks like yourself to really have a good critical, eye and mind on this stuff and say, okay, there's some promise, but let's not get too ahead of ourselves yet. I guess the last question I have for you is, you explain kind of the cryptic effects of maternal-fetal relationships. And so, what can we say at this point? You walk us through and march us through the whole history of maternal and fetal effects. What can we say kind of pragmatically? I mean, I know you're not a medical doctor, but just as a historian, some of the philosopher, a thinker, what would you say, I guess, to the pregnant woman who's trying to think about these things intelligibly and stuff like that? Obviously, listen to your doctors, all that stuff. But just from a historical, contextual standpoint, what can we say about the impact of the social, environmental factors and how they influence and then yes, your genes, and what could you kind of say? Not definitively, but something that you could kind of hang your hat on about these exchanges between the genetics and the environment in this way.
Gosh, well, what I would say to the pregnant mother is you're entering into a symbolic and discursive space that was formed well before you. And you're going to get a lot of advice and a lot of claims about risk.
Yeah.
And get ready for thinking critically. Laugh to yourself and think about how in the early 20th century, women were told to do math equations to make while pregnant to increase the arithmetic skills of your child. My message is really not for the pregnant woman so much as the policymaker and the scientific researcher. And my message is around situating this work with clarity about the biopolitics, of risk discourse and the world of claims making that their science will inevitably enter and in which it will inevitably be received. And so risk claims need to be properly contextualized. And the degree of risk needs to be made clear. The degree of uncertainty about the claims being made needs to be clear. We must rigorously test claims about maternal fetal influences in a variety of ways, which means I give several ways, but means, for example, including fathers in the study design. In several large claims that have been made in this field, once you add fathers into the study design, turns out that both mothers and fathers' habits explain the outcomes. So there is a real need to get outside of the framework of mothers harming fetuses, which is an emotionally overpowering frame for thinking about things, and instead into a framework that is about empowering parents to assess risk claims in the context of their own lives.
No, that's beautifully said, and I think that's the important message to take away, and that's certainly what much of what I got from reading your book, which was masterfully done. So the book is called The Maternal Imprint: The Contested Science of Maternal-Fetal Effects. Where can people buy that? Where can they find your work and find you online in all the relevant places?
Find me online through the lab that I direct called GenderSci Lab, genderscilab.org. And the book should be available at most major outlets. Yeah.
Well, look, Sarah, you've been so generous with your time and your brilliant mind. Really, this was so informative for me and reading it and talking with you, and I really hope it is for all listeners. I just can't thank you enough for coming on and sharing with us your knowledge and your passion, and so it really was quite enjoyable.